something that Mum said in the garden is that the gardening is definitely part of the creative life that you and Mum have.
It surely is, yeah.
That was really interesting that you said that, because there's so many gardening metaphors and references to gardening throughout this book, The Artist's Way. For example, in the final pages of it, Julia Cameron, who's the author, highlights gardening is a hobby I often assign to creativity students. When someone is panicked halfway across the bridge into a new life, we'll come back to that process, repotting plants into larger and better containers quite literally grounds that person and gives him or her a sense of expansion. What role does gardening play within your life, within your creative life? And does any aspect of that assignment that Cameron gives to her creativity students make sense to you?
Potting on from one size pot to the next one is like a progression, which is a recurring activity.
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of proves to you in that moment that you're making progress.
Yeah, so there's repetition, but there's also development.
Yeah, I'm not sure it makes me feel like that's a great trick for grounding people if they're panicking.
It's not just to counter panic, but specifically, she says, if someone is panicked halfway across the bridge into a new life. So this book, at the top here, it says it's a course in discovering and recovering your creative self.
Yeah.
And it has a lot to do with thinking and the brain, with lots of overlap with the themes that have been coming up in these videos. She talks about the logic brain and the artist brain. Let's dive into that to help get a sense of this metaphor of the bridge, like halfway into the new life. What does she mean by that?
Yeah.
So she thinks that creativity is our true nature. Literally everyone is essentially creative. And blocks are an unnatural thwarting of a process at once as normal and as miraculous as the blossoming of a flower at the end of a slender green stem.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that?
I think potentially that could be true.
So she has a very specific way of making sense of how and why her practices work. But she encourages people who might be skeptical of her explanation as to why they work to try them anyway, because they work. And she says, in short, the theory doesn't matter as much as the practice itself does. What you are doing is creating pathways in your consciousness through which the creative forces can operate. Once you agree to clearing these pathways, your creativity emerges. In a sense, your creativity is like your blood. So it's just as natural for you to blossom as an artist as it is for the bud to blossom.
Mm-hmm.
And then she says, just as blood is a fact of your physical body and nothing you invented, creativity is a fact of your spiritual body and nothing you must invent. My expectation has been that you would really connect and relate to the metaphors from nature to explain creativity, but be perhaps a bit more resistant to statements like creativity is a fact of your spiritual body and nothing you must invent. Is that the case?
I don't feel that resistant to that, really.
Ah.
I suspect that a lot of people can't find time for creativity and can't find that that's in sync with what they're asked to do every day. So it could be very much suppressed by just the routine of life.
There are 12 chapters in the book. Each of them takes a different approach to discovering and recovering your creative self.
Yeah.
So chapter 1 is about recovering a sense of safety, and each of them is recovering a sense of something. So then we have identity, power, integrity, possibility, abundance, connection, strength, compassion, self-protection, autonomy, and faith. And the idea is that there are many possible blocks that could be happening.
Yeah.
You know, I spoke with Mum about fame, because there's that section on fame in her book. There's a section on fame in this book too, where the artist's desire to become famous through their art or to have public recognition can be one of very many possible blocks.
Yeah.
She encourages two main tools. One is the artist date, which is just time that you set aside. You make time. You were saying not everyone has time. So the idea is your needs are important. You are essentially creative if only you can harness it.
Yeah.
So if you can find X amount of time in a week, not even just to do something artistic, but to go on an artist date, which is effectively just doing something on your own that you think is likely to nurture and cultivate the inner child, which is the artist.
Yeah.
And treat that inner child well, and the inner child will blossom.
Yeah.
So that's one of the two tools, and the other tool is morning pages, where every morning the first thing that you do is for 15-20 minutes write.
Or if your art form isn't to do with words, then maybe just draw or
write.
Write.
Yeah. If you.
Well, then I might give you some resistance to that.
I'll explain why this is.
Yeah.
It seems strange and counterintuitive, though, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And she expects people who are not writers, especially people who have busy lives, who are not writers, to be resistant to the idea that, well, you just need to spend 15-20 minutes every morning writing. What's your initial reaction to the idea that you could harness your creativity, recover your creative self, if only you write whatever is in your head for 15 or 20 minutes in the morning?
I wouldn't be in a hurry to disprove it. At the moment, I always go to the computer for the first couple hours of my day to perpetuate whatever obsession I'm in pursuit of.
Yeah, you're at the war table.
I'm at the war table
regarding
Ragwort.
Yeah.
Yeah. And even that is a fairly creative process. But and I'm not doing much writing. I'm usually researching or drafting and redrafting some warlike missive to somebody.
Yeah, also on the warpath. In Britain's Green Mantle, there's a focus on the end on conservation involving not just passing of an act, but lots of work.
Yeah.
We can lose sight of the actual work that needs to be done.
Yeah.
And you're committed to doing the work. That's the story that you would tell, and there's some truth to the story.
Yes, absolutely. And that sort of is in harmony with my preoccupation through life, that implementation is more important than having the idea in the first place. I am an implementer rather than a visionary by nature, and I value implementation skills more than I value insight.
Yeah. So the word implementation definitely implies that there is a vision that needs to be implemented.
Yeah.
So the vision comes first, and that's the right one, and that gets implemented.
Yeah.
And she's focusing on practice too. Like, I was quoting, the theory doesn't matter as much as the practice itself does. She claims that if you do these things, if you apply the practices related to the 12 different chapters, a breakthrough will essentially follow. Necessarily, a breakthrough will follow. Whether you believe it or not, whether you call it a spiritual awakening or not. And she talks a lot about the spiritual aspect of creativity. Like the subtitle to the book is a spiritual pathway to higher creativity. So she's using the word spiritual and she's using the word God a lot. But she says, when the word God is used in these pages, you may substitute the thought good, orderly direction, like it's an acronym, God, good, orderly direction, or flow. And she's saying, if you are able to quiet the logic brain, which she relates to the sensor, and she suggests the morning pages are the key way that you can do this, then the inner child artist will naturally come into being. And she encourages people to just give it a try and get into this flow state, because everything is creative energy and you can get into the flow of it by using these methods. What do you think about that idea, especially given she's using metaphors like the blossoming flower to suggest this is just the nature of existence?
Well, I think if I'm wanting to be creative, I don't usually feel blocked. And I think
if you desire to be creative.
Yeah, and that spontaneously arises a lot of the time. So I think possibly I've accidentally woke up from the suppression that she's referring to.
Yeah. How did this accident occur for you, do you think?
Well, just by things like discovering that the techniques I've picked up to manage hedgerows and woodlands have an aesthetic aspect all of their own, and you can trip into consequences that are creative as a consequence just by exploring the techniques. So I think I sort of stumbled into being creative by allowing instincts to take over a bit.
Yeah, which relates, I think, to the focus on feelings and what feelings are in the previous long episode of Into the Field, with feelings being the treetops of life regulation.
Yeah.
You were saying when you want to be creative, when you have the desire and you just let it go, you just let that desire
let it happen,
lead. That's going to be a lot more forceful and powerful than anything cerebral. In Into the Field, the war table is related to the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain which relates to planning. So what do you think about the relationship between this creativity, which is related to the limbic brain and feelings, and implementing, which is more related to the cortex?
Yeah, I'm not sure they are strongly linked, really.
Yeah, they're quite different, aren't they?
Yeah.
But both of these things are important to you.
Yeah.
Making sure that the good plan is implemented.
Yeah.
And then a very different set of skills and parts of the brain and body are involved in the flow of creativity that you also
probably good implementation doesn't leave much scope for creativity, because creativity sort of suggests departures from the path you're on, pausing for thought, all that kind of stuff, whereas implementing is more to do with get the job done.
This is what we need to do to save the planet and avoid disaster.
Yeah.
Let's do that.
Yeah.
As opposed to
make it
something different.
As opposed to making it look pretty along the way.
Right.
Because there probably isn't time to do that.
Yeah, or have beginner's mind. So just being open and excited about observing different things when there's a crisis situation where things need to be implemented.
Yeah.
A sentence that really struck me coming back to this book in the context of doing the Into the Field project is this: art is the imagination at play in the field of time. Let yourself play. And that's immediately after saying artist's block is a very literal expression. Blocks must be acknowledged and dislodged, which is the essential idea here. Like everyone is essentially creative. We each develop different blocks to the flow. The reason why it's writing in the morning is the idea is that you can get whatever is in your mind, the stuff that you wouldn't want to share with anyone else, just what is in your mind, the things that you're upset about, angry about, what you are embarrassed about, what you hope for, just whatever is in the mind, have it kind of flow out, and then you can look at it.
But that, if I was doing that, it probably wouldn't end up as something you'd call writing.
Yeah, and this is...
It would end up as a scatter diagram or something like that.
And there's no assumption that this will lead to art. It will enable you to recognize the blocks and to recognize what you need to observe yourself, which is why it's so interesting. Spinoza is very important for me. You know, I have published scholarship on Spinoza, and Antonio Damasio's book from last week is called Looking for Spinoza, Joy, Sorrow and the Feeling Brain. And she has a quote from Spinoza, which I had forgotten about, right near the beginning. Do not weep, do not wax indignant, understand, is a quote from Spinoza in chapter 1 here. And so there's this sense that if we can just have the courage to recognize where our blocks are and then deploy different tools to work at remedying those blocks, removing those blocks, then the flow state is our natural state. Which interestingly relates to, you know, your joy at being in harmony with nature. It's like humans are part of nature. That's a key thing for Spinoza.
Yeah.
For Spinoza, everything is nature, everything is God. There's just one substance, and every individual thing that you could think of is a mode, is a part of that. There's one God, we're all part of God. There's one nature, we're all part of nature. Humans are not part of nature. So that's that's what nature means for Spinoza.
Yeah.
If something exists, it's nature.
Yeah.
It really seems like, you know, you feel more in harmony with nature and more in touch with your creative self in large part through experimenting with these different practices.
Yeah. There's also the issue that a lot of the art I produce is not necessarily what most people would call art. But once you discover someone like David Nash, who had the same doubts actually when he set off in the direction of deciding to be an artist, but he made structures out of wood, and he wasn't sure that it was art to start with, but he became very confident it was. So the fact that he could produce so much stuff that I think a lot of people would question as to whether it's art, and he felt reassured as he went through it that he was an artist and he was producing art, then that helped me think, well, it doesn't really matter what other people think, but if he can think that's art, I can think what I do is art.
Yeah, right. So it doesn't matter what other people think, how it's received.
Generally, that's the case.
Yeah,
it's
that's
painful
the key thing in here too.
if nobody notices what I see in it, then that makes you feel lonely. But there are a few people who will resonate with what I think is worth doing. I've found.
A lot of her methods, the more specific practices and tasks that she assigns at the end of each chapter, relate to freeing the budding artist from concern about what other people might think. Because that's gonna, you know, a lot of the blocks are going to be to do with what is acceptable, and like I said, one manifestation of this could be the desire to be famous, but then feeling I'm not good enough, I don't have enough time, it's not sensible to be an artist, I'm too old, and any of these different possible blocks. She says the morning pages are the primary tool of creative recovery, so they are fundamental for her. But the reason I brought them up primarily with you is because it's then that she starts thinking about the logic brain and the artist brain. She says, logic brain was and is our survival brain. It works on known principles. Anything unknown is perceived as wrong and possibly dangerous. Whereas the artist brain is our creative, holistic brain. It thinks in patterns and shadings. Artist brain is associative and freewheeling. It makes new connections, yoking together images to invoke meaning. And this word yoking, actually, I happened to discover yesterday, that's where the word yoga comes from. And yoga, is about bringing things into connection. A yoga practitioner was saying it's like yoking a carriage to a horse. So what do you think about this way of describing the logic brain and the artist brain? Logic brain related to survival, anything unknown is perceived as wrong and possibly dangerous. Artist brain, creative, holistic, thinking in patterns and shadings, associative, freewheeling.
Well, I think, dwelling on how I do use my day, that I do separate these things, that I do sort of reward myself with creative periods and intersperse that with periods of implementation. So that's exactly what's happening out there in the creation of this woodland. The rooting up of the weeds is really quite boring and heavy duty, but if I've done a spate of that, then I'll feel that it's about time that I did something which I could enjoy. And so that's when,
in the moment,
not with any purpose other than me enjoying that moment of doing what it is.
Yeah.
And that's where things like the ridiculously large enclosure around the nursery bed for the hazels.
Yeah, to stop the giant rabbit.
To stop the giant rabbit is a major self-indulgence.
Yeah. After all of that necessary uprooting of weeds, which is extremely time-consuming
and tedious
and exhausting.
Yeah.
Yeah. You're quite aware, would you say, of shifting between logic brain and artist brain?
Not in that sense, but that there is that shift, definitely. So
implementing and enjoying.
Yeah, quite separately.
Yeah. And the implementing has a key role because, if you were just making the rabbit protection structure, there would be nothing to protect from the rabbits.
Exactly.
Yeah, the rabbits don't exist.
No, that doesn't matter.
Exist.
That's a detail.
but neither would the trees.
No.
If you didn't have the implementation.
Which goes back to you can't be self-indulgent all the time, otherwise there won't be any output that's worthy and that would justify you enjoying that activity.
The way in which you're talking about it there, it makes it seem like, you have to do the work to be worthy, use the word worthy, of the reward, of the enjoyment.
Yeah.
That's interesting because in that context, if you want the enjoyment to take the form of there being trees, then that's true. There's a certain set of things that need to be done in a certain order, which could include an artful creation of a...
Yeah, I mean, the trees are a bit of a slow burn, so the enjoyment of those trees flourishing is not available for a long time yet.
Very, very delayed gratification.
Yes.
Yeah. With an awareness as well that it's not only doing these things now that will lead to the trees, but the trees are a commitment that, you were saying, like for the 10, it's like a 10-year commitment.
Yeah.
To get the trees to the stage where then they will
They're
be
self-sufficient. Yeah. Yeah, I think all we're talking about there is field patterns. But all we're talking about here is a heart shape. I love fields.
So this is consciously a heart shape.
That was definitely consciously a heart shape.
Why do you love these fields?
Well, I just do. I mean, it's my earliest memories of enjoying being on a farm were all to do with being close up to fields and helping my dad do stuff.
What is it about helping your dad, who was farming the land, do stuff, or being involved in working on the fields? What is it about that you love so much?
There's a lot of self-worth that comes from doing something productive in a field that you know is helping to make the farm tick over.
It's tangible.
I had a crazy task once, and it's a very vivid memory that, and I think it was purely a test that Dad would have to see if I would ever be any use on the farm.
Okay.
So you have this this machine that cuts the grass, and it goes round the field in a circle.
What's the machine called?
It's the mowing machine.
Okay.
And you haven't seen one, but you've been here, because this is one of those that has reciprocating blades.
But you and John were talking about it.
We were talking about it as an old type of mowing machine. So it would go around the field with this plate sticking out from the side of the tractor, and you'd cut continuously on a continuous basis further and further towards the middle of the field. But the first row you can't cut close to the hedge because that's where the tractor is going. So there's a final cut which is going around the field the opposite way at the very end. And once the first cycle had been completed, then there was the opportunity for a small boy, 5 or 6 years old, on his hands and knees, to go along and push the grass out of the way around the whole perimeter of that field to enable the tractor to have easy access to the last run around the outside.
And you think so?
And that's what I did.
And that was, you think, a means of testing?
Well, I don't know if it was. It never struck me as a means of testing at the time, but I think it was like, will he take to it? Will he enjoy making a contribution? And can I make him learn that being useful is a good thing? And I certainly did. I wouldn't remember it now if I hadn't thought, blimey, this is really good, productive stuff, because I can work really hard for about an hour and Dad will be able to go around the outside. I mean, quite frankly, you could go around the outside without me doing that, I think.
But you didn't think that at the time?
That didn't occur to me at the time.
Yeah, and the love, the feeling, of being of use in a way that was in harmony with nature and that was helping.
Yeah. There was harmony with nature and there was harmony in the family, and that we were contributing to doing something. And as a small boy, that's one of the few things I could do at that stage which would be useful. It was far too soon to be milking cows, so it felt good.
And you were the oldest son, so there was perhaps an expectation that you would become the farmer?
Possibly there was an expectation that we both would end up farming, but
you and your little brother.
I think later on it became obvious that it might be smart to have one of us not farming to make it a viable proposition to give the one who did farm a start.
Yeah. So then you went off to university.
Yeah.
Worked for 3M, strangely, because then I later on went to Minnesota.
Yeah.
Minnesota is one of the 3Ms. And now you've returned. Could you just say a little bit about your return to Dorset?
Well, when Dad died, I inherited some farmland, and it was in Dorset, which is a couple 100 miles from where I was living. And so initially, I couldn't do anything much with it other than allow the tenancies that are applied to it to roll forward.
So that was Farmer John?
That was Farmer John White. And I definitely felt uncomfortable that I was managing some inherited land without knowing much about what was happening day to day. And it was getting to a stage at work where options to retire early were cropping up. So I made a kind of bold decision that I would learn what I needed to know to manage that land.
So you took a course in countryside management?
I took a course, full-year course in countryside management. I knew what I wanted to do was to lay some hedges, so I explored the options for learning how to lay hedges, and you could learn to lay a hedge in a couple of days at the most. But I found a course that took a whole year to learn to lay hedges and to learn about habitat management and all kinds of things that would be agricultural land management.
What was the name of that course?
It was called Countryside Management at Mareswood College, and it seemed like such a good idea to have not just one skill which would allow me to maintain some badly maintained hedges, but to know the whole package, and that's what I did. So I spent a year doing that.
And interesting to transition from managing people and overseeing mergers with 3M to management of the land.
Yeah, and it was a dramatic difference. One that meant I didn't need to get involved in any supervisory things. I was only supervising myself, and going back to exploring my roots a bit. And I had no idea really what I would do with the land, other than the fact that I could maintain it and stop it perhaps getting a little bit out of control or something.
You felt, on the one hand, a responsibility and an obligation to do so.
Yeah.
It would be strange to not understand and be involved in the maintenance of the
I thought
land.
it would be wasteful to just sort of cash in, sell the land, and just carry on as if I'd never had any roots in the West Country. And of course I was also very attracted to the West Country. It's a beautiful place, so half thinking that the family could be uprooted and brought back here was
Uproot it
part of it.
and replant it, like the tree.
Yeah. It wasn't a straightforward thing, so I had no reason to expect Sue to want to live in the countryside. She never had.
Mm-hmm. And I was going off to university at the time, and David, my younger brother, would do the same shortly afterwards.
Yeah.
And then we would both leave the country.
Yeah, it's true. So a lot of things were disappearing from Sue's life at the time.
Yeah.
And I think I had to walk very carefully. So I kind of worked out that there was going to need to be quite a lot of time spent in Dorset without the necessity of deciding that we relocate to Dorset, and there was no place to relocate to, and because you kids had not left home, you'd just gone to universities, then home was still in Camberley. So the equilibrium point seemed to be I'd just rent a flat in Charmouth and
spend some time
here when it was in season to do the hedge laying and the coppicing and stuff that I was going to end up doing. And we'd visit each other, and other times I imagine I spent at home. But of course there was a whole year anyway before I launched into that of going to do this course, and that was really quite intensive because I hadn't been to school for a while.
Mm-hmm.
I was learning stuff that was new to me. I'd done great at schools, I suppose, with things like maths and physics and science generally, but
that's
biology.
What you studied at university.
Maths. Yeah, but so science was interesting. I kind of steered away from biology because I was a bit squeamish and I didn't want to dissect frogs specifically. So I never did biology, which means botany and zoology were not part of my O-level education.
Yeah, but those things then cause you to faint, so you could then make up for lost time.
Yeah, I could definitely do that. So I had some land. I had the experience of being a kid on a farm, so I knew an awful lot about what happens. A lot had changed in the meantime because when I was a kid, it was post-war agriculture is to do exclusively with producing food and being self-sufficient with food. By the time I'm at retirement age, the land in the landscape is to do with wildlife and recreation for urban living people, more than it's to do with producing food. And so it was a time when more money was being put into restoring habitats than producing greater yields of crops. So it was a good time actually to involve yourself with some stewardships which were sort of funding for the work I would end up doing.
And this is in the first decade of the new millennium.
Yeah.
Alongside becoming more engaged in the management of the countryside, you've also given more free rein to your creative side.
Yeah, that's true. When I was at school, I enjoyed art. I loved art. It kind of got squeezed out by the focus on mathematics, although there is quite a bit about mathematics. The attraction to mathematics is not that far from being interested in shape. So if it's geometry or algebra, there's shapes involved. So I think it's the same kind of brain space involved, but didn't have a chance to do much of that at work. I ended up in marketing for some of the time, so I could do kind of creative things and promotional material and things, but there wasn't much of a outlet. So as it turns out, in handling the materials that I would choose to find myself handling in hedge laying or coppicing, I developed some dexterity with bill hooks and saws and chainsaws, and it became sort of second nature to mess around with bits of wood.
Can you recall when that transition happened, when you realised that you had tools that you could utilise for creative purposes?
I found hedge laying to be a very aesthetically pleasing process, and I was surprised by that because it's just hard work really, but it seemed that when you cut into the stem and laid the stem over and did a neat job cutting off the bit you cut into, and the laying over fell into a space it seemed to want to go to, it seemed almost like preordained. It seemed a very comfortable process.
There was a sense of harmony again.
There is a sense of harmony again, yeah. So I imagine it is harmonious because over centuries people have developed this technique and realised that this is the harmonious thing, the best way to handle this situation where you want to regenerate the density of a hedge. So I was beginning to get sort of vibes about there is some aesthetics involved in this. It's not just brute force and ignorance or just practice, it's actually quite creative. So there were hints going on. And then I was beginning to get more interested in what other art is there. And I was interested in willow weaving. I can't quite remember why, but I ended up going to a 2-day workshop with Caroline Sharp. Caroline Sharp made the piece that's in our lounge on the wall. There's that big heart-shaped thing, the bushy thing. So she was a willow weaver, and I learned a few techniques from her, and it became obvious that you can do things with willow to basically strap things together. So instead of using string or wire or anything industrial, you could, if you had the right kind of willow, you could tie things together in a very natural way. So that
such
sort
as
of registered
for what became your Globe Theatre eventually.
Yeah. So there are a number of opportunities for using the willow weaving technique just to assemble things. And so I've made quite a few structures recently that have relied entirely on the tricks of Caroline Sharp's trade. And they don't look like willow weaving at all, they're just things that are bound with willow to make an assembly. So exploring that became an opportunity when I was laying a particular hedge which was a bit gappy, and I wanted to fill the gap, and there was an opportunity to harvest quite a lot of bright orange willow, which I did for somebody that just happened to have lots of it. So I had a large bulk of this material, and I could weave that into a hedge, and it made a glorious photograph later on, because some brown and white and black and white cows were looking over this hedge, and they had a nice bit of willow weaving in it. And so I began to realise that I could mix my country crafts with some artistic introduction of detail.
So you accidentally became an artist in this medium.
Yeah.
Through getting a little bit carried away and enjoying that willow weaving.
Yeah.
And then the cows stepped in.
And I realised, okay, I can actually expect to bring an artistic thrust into this purely functional activity and end up with an outcome which I'm pleased with aesthetically.
Where's this hedge?
I sold the field, so we don't have it anymore.
Okay.
But I got a photograph. I could probably dig out a photograph that shows what it is. That's one of the fields we sold to Rob at Hogchester, because he needed more land.
Yeah.
And of course, he's inherited one or two pieces of land art which I've made in the woods there that he just stayed with the land that we sold to him.
Yes.
So that's
as we saw earlier in the.
As we saw
in the spring.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When we went to see the wildflower meadows, we went to see bits of art.
You reflect on the tribe quite a bit. You kind of you use the word the tribe or tribalism.
Yeah, I see a lot of. There's an awful lot of talk on the telly about the divide, whether it's Brexit or how the pandemic should be managed or anything else. And I don't like the extent to which people adopt tribes. I mean, and your war thing, We Are Right, is very much the tribal brand. You know, just join my tribe and you can be right with me.
Right, and the people that are not with us are against us. It's an us versus them.
Yeah, and of course social media does a great job of making those voices loud.
Yeah.
And some people would be now too timid to speak back. Yes. Because you'll get a backlash.
And when you are creating art without really caring too much about the fact that a lot of people wouldn't perceive it as art, inspired by, say, Andy Goldsworthy or whomever, then you're functioning outside of being overly concerned about the tribal consciousness. Is the tribe a purely bad thing?
Well, I suppose not, because families, when they function well, are a tribe by definition.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of comfort to be drawn from being in a family. So it's only when you go plural, the family is one entity. But if you get rival families, then you've got the warring faction. So,
and I mean, also the same issues that apply to a tribe, whatever a tribe is, could also apply to a family if the family thinks, we are right, or our family first. These same issues can manifest in any group.
Yeah.
Where there's groupthink and a prioritization of the needs or even just or the rights of the members of that group above others. So the reason why I brought up the tribe and tribalism is because Julia Cameron says, remember that creativity is a tribal experience and that tribal elders will initiate the gifted youngsters who cross their paths. She says, this may sound like wishful thinking, but it's not. Sometimes an older artist will be moved to help out even against his or her own wishes. There is like a tribe of artists. And
yeah, there is.
Yeah, so what do you think about that?
Well, I think that's the case. Last year, Elizabeth Fortescue died, and she was very much an encouraging source for me. She was a very accomplished artist, and she was very giving, and she would share what she knows.
Mm.
But in the main, what I got from Elizabeth was lots of encouragement. So she was like a tribal elder in the context you're speaking of, and gave me lots of moral support without me thinking I need some moral support.
That's a clear example of the good side of the tribe, as is a functional family too.
Yeah, and that was at no disadvantage to anybody else. So that was just between her and me. So at a point in time when I'd been exploring my artistic drive for a while, she chose to put some of my things in her exhibition, and in reality, the main wall in the Malt House that you would expect her to put her pictures on,
mm-hmm.
she donated that wall to me for this one piece that was called The Hillside, because she felt it would look good there.
Ah.
So that's where it really came home to me that she was really giving me a reinforcing feedback.
When was that?
I guess it was about 5 years ago.
So first there were the cows who went and stood by the hedge.
Yeah.
And they were a catalyst.
Well, yeah, because they completed a picture. They turned a construct of mine accidentally into a nice picture that, I mean, it almost looked as if the brown cows were matching the willow. So that was an accident. But this was you're right to pick it up as another event that says you're on a path that's worth following.
Yeah.
So that was good.
Yeah, and so what do you think about those moments? You know, she just said some of these helping hands may not be human, and then you have the cows. And
the cows showing up.
That could be complete coincidence, of course. And then you also have the tribal elder. A lot of nice things kind of coming together in terms of your return to Dorset and you know, your discovery of higher creativity, perhaps, without stumbling upon it in the way that you described it.
Yeah.
So she says that things like that will happen just as a result of the blocks being removed. And she uses synchronicity, the word synchronicity, to describe it. And she says, you know, the universe is very giving. So this is very at odds with the, you know, when we have the implementer mindset, we think presumably we think something like, you know, authorities, maybe scientific authorities have determined what causes what and therefore what needs to be implemented. And the idea that magical synchronicities will happen if you just let go and surrender to the universe, you know, is quite at odds with that mindset. Yeah,
but it makes me think that total separation isn't that helpful. I mean, because if that synchronicity is going to be the thing that triggers something new, it means that while you're busily implementing, if you're just focused on that, you might miss it.
Right, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So that there must be some space left for the creative juices to flow. But I think I find that relatively easy. I'm daydreaming all the time when I'm implementing. Once I know that I'm on a path that's prescribed, I don't waste any time thinking about, is this worth doing, or is it the best way to do it? I just pursue it. But then that means I've got lots of space in the brain that can be spent daydreaming.
Yeah, you're potting the plants effectively. There's a procedure to follow.
Yeah.
She uses that example at the end, you know, the hobby of gardening, like at the end. That's in the chapter on faith.
Tell me more about the faith aspect then. I mean, where does she talk about faith being a big component in rediscovering creativity?
The final chapter begins, creativity requires faith. Faith requires that we relinquish control. So it's not so, you know, a traditional religious person might say, I have faith, and then they'll be in the tribe of the people that believe the same thing.
Yeah.
And But the faith goes, the word faith is not the word belief for a reason. There's a stepping out into something beyond what can be seen, perhaps, that requires relinquishing control. So stepping out beyond the belief system. She's suggesting that when we do that, which could involve leaving the tribe of people who think of themselves as having faith, then that opens things up. She says, this is frightening and we resist it. Our resistance to our creativity is a form of self-destruction because we're essentially creative. Each of us has an inner dream that we can unfold if we will just have the courage to admit what it is and the faith to trust our own admission. So I'm just reading the beginning of the chapter on faith there. She quotes Joseph Campbell, "Follow your bliss and doors will open where there were no doors before," is what Joseph Campbell says.
Yeah, so I think it is saying take chances. It is saying don't worry about the outcome. Don't prejudge that a failure is imminently going to happen just because you're not certain about the outcome. And speaking for me personally, in certain modes of life, particularly when I was at work, a fear of failure would be a very strong influence. I wouldn't want to be doing anything that would entertain the possibility of it fail. I'd feel bad about being associated with any failures. So that is an inhibitor.
So when you're working that job for 3M, then there's your inner milieu, which doesn't encourage risk-taking and does reward the planning and implementing and using a method to achieve tangible expected results.
Yeah.
That's good, and it has its place and you still use those skills. But if that is the milieu, it doesn't leave a lot of space for the cultivation of this completely separate thing.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
So that's been your experience.
Yeah.
Now, I think getting the balance of the two, relating to the top-down and the bottom-up approach and those not coming together in general in the culture, that's an ideal that it's good to be conscious of and to celebrate because it is a wholesome ideal.
Yeah. It's a thing that I can enjoy because I'm in the privileged position of being retired. It's not something I could easily translate into the me of 30 years ago or anybody else who's trying to hold a family together in terms of getting money in and stuff like that.
And she's suggesting that anyone, no matter how complicated and demanding their life is and how scarce the resources are, anyone, if they are blocked, can use the morning pages and the artist day and these tools to create a little walled garden on their metaphorical land where there will be just enough space for a bit of that good, orderly direction. Because that's about faith. One says some lived experience of this flow through creativity, of these magical things happening, or these unplanned, joyful occurrences. Once there's enough space, if there's a recipe for creating it, it's just basically relinquishing control. And you have experience of that. Her idea is that any life can make room for like one little seedling of that.
Yeah.
And then like the mushrooms on your sculpture, or that create the magical rings in the field.
In the field, yeah.
Then they will proliferate in any life.
Yeah, especially if you are looking for them or receptive to the thought that, oh yes, here's another one. Yeah, indeed.
So that's what this is all about. And she says to use a gardening image, we must learn to not pull our ideas up by the roots to see if they are growing.
That's an interesting analogy, actually, because, I mean, pulling something up by the roots to see if it's growing, that would be an obviously bad thing to do.
An unwelcome intrusion.
Yeah, an unwelcome intrusion, but you might be tempted to do it if you had a moment of severe doubt.
Is something happening? I can't believe something's happening.
Yeah.
Let's see if something's happening, and then it makes it not happen.
Oh, look, lovely roots. Whoops.
And you don't even know that you've stopped the thing from happening.
Well, maybe not, but as long as, while we're talking about repotting, then you are doing just that, but carefully, in a sort of planned, implemented way.
Yeah. The very final pages are about magic. The first rule of magic is self-containment, it says. You must hold your intention within yourself, stoking it with power. Only then will you be able to manifest what you desire. So the idea of manifesting what you desire is like a magical equivalent of implementing what you plan.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the idea, as much as there's all of this focus on surrendering and relinquishing control, there is also a focus on a lot of very conscious control, like boundary setting, like putting the walls up in the walled garden to protect the seedlings. And the people who will be skeptical and be like, that's not art, or that's not the way to do things, they're like the deer or the rabbits, perhaps, that are walled out from this area. So the first principle of magic is self-containment. There is this necessity to protect things. In her way of thinking about things, there is already a kind of bringing together of the two. And here's a plan to be creative. You need to implement this plan.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's also there.
Yeah. Well, the whole book is such a implementation guide.
Yeah.
It seems.
Yeah, that's interesting. The stereotype of the unruly artist is definitely something, she kind of counters that near the beginning. The idea that the artist is unable to hold it down a job, and is not going to have any money, and is promiscuous, and is unruly, and that's one way of imagining the artist, but the true artist who is in the flow, who has discovered or recovered their creative self, is quite disciplined, actually.
Yeah.
There is an artist's way.
Yeah.
Which can be implemented.
Yeah.
And I think, that's just as important, even, or especially for her, I think, as the idea of just surrender.
There's the Morecambe Lake Arts Group that we're members of, where these two workshops were organised. I mean, the whole thesis of that group is that there are ways of unblocking your artistic flow. And that things like having a sketchbook, which I don't do, but I do believe it is effective, are techniques. So this lady's got a more complex package of guidelines. But it's recognised by that group of people that we can help each other to move through any blockages that are in the way.
And she focuses on community and the tribe. That's the tribe again. That's a good tribe.
Yeah, it's a constructive tribe.
Yeah.
I seem to accept a lot of those thoughts.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. You're on the artist's way.
Yeah. I doubt that I would have found that without being retired first. See, when I was working for 3M, I would have been content to go and look at art.
Like, those are the artists, and
I'm the audience.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm out there earning some money for the family, and in my spare time, I can soak up what these creative people have been doing.
So through your experience, you agree with a lot of what she's saying. In her most condensed explanation of what she's saying, she'll say things like, what we are talking about is an induced or invited spiritual experience. I refer to this process as spiritual chiropractic. we undertake certain spiritual exercises to achieve alignment with the creative energy of the universe. So she says things like that, and that's supposed to encapsulate the fundamental reality of all of the other particular things she's saying.
Yeah,
which you relate, you agree with all of those things.
Yeah, but that's like a foreign language.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so if I were to...
If you were to start with that, I'd be saying, well, what else could we talk about?
Yeah, exactly. Which is how it starts.
Yeah, okay.
So, the next little paragraph is, if you think of the universe as a vast electrical sea in which you are immersed and from which you are formed, opening to your creativity changes you from something bobbing in that sea to a more fully functioning, more conscious, more cooperative part of that ecosystem.
That's okay as a metaphor, that one.
Yeah.
But before that, I can't remember exactly what it was, it seemed too foreign and too sort of cerebral to be helpful to the people she's trying to help.
This section is called Spiritual Electricity, the basic principles. That's like right at the beginning.
Right.
You might have so much resistance to that framing
that I wouldn't get beyond that page.
That you wouldn't get beyond that page. Yeah. But what she's describing is your experience.
Yeah.
She says the heart of creativity is an experience of the mystical union. The heart of the mystical union is an experience of creativity. This is the same person. Each of these things are your experience. Like she would say that, there's a mystical component to that.
Yeah.
And you are stepping out on faith, and you are discovering things about the nature of ultimate reality, she would say.
Yeah, I'm sure she would. I don't know where this interview will be circulated, but if John White was to listen to some of this, I'd be embarrassed. Because he's very grounded in the implementation of farming practice.
Yeah.
I don't know the extent to which he has an artistic interest.
Yeah.
And I've never talked to him about these lumps of wood that I leave lying around that he sees every day he comes up here.
Yeah.
So I don't know how weird he finds that.
This was my thought going into these interviews with you and Mum, that on the one hand, your experience with gardening and with the land would make a lot of her metaphors and her processes very relatable.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, her mysticism and framing of everything as related to spiritual electricity, and talking of God, would be something that you would be resistant to.
Well, it's just alien speak, really. So I think there's a danger of her losing her target audience by frightening them off at the beginning.
The people that are blocked, that could,
that could gain from these techniques.
Businessman you, who has a family to make money, you need to make money for, and you have creative interests and you have the experience going back to when you were 5 or 11 or whatever it was in the field. There's all of that which is just waiting to be harnessed, but if it's described in this way, then it's just going to seem completely irrelevant to you. And
that's right, yeah. But although creativity wasn't being harnessed, the implementation mode was actually seeded in that field that I was plotting my way around. So someone said, this needs doing, John, and he's doing, by the time I finished getting to the middle, if it's going to be of any benefit to me, and I went ahead and implemented.
In the
That's
field of
the first thing I can remember ever implementing.
Which again makes me think of being at play in the field of time, but you're at work in the field of time.
Yeah.
There.
Yeah, but I can remember almost turning it into an art form. So you would find that rather than just struggle to move this grass, because it had been cut by moving in one direction, and there was a swathe there was a gadget at the back which would turn it over. So it all lay in a particular way. And if you approached it the right way, you could turn it with ease. If you were haphazard about it, it would be more of a struggle. So there was a sort of an aesthetic feel about getting it right.
Yeah, it kind of taught you about getting in a flow state.
Yeah. Just to move some grass. And I think I was probably 11 or 12.
Yeah. We'll close with me quoting one last thing,
yeah.
which also references a field, and you responding to that. It is my experience, both as an artist and as a teacher, that when we move out on faith into the act of creation, the universe is able to advance. It is a little like opening the gate at the top of a field irrigation system. Once we remove the blocks, the flow moves in.
Well, that makes it sound easier than it is, I think.
Yeah, well, that's why there's the whole book after
yeah.
that thing.
Because that presupposes that the gate is at the top of the field and there's all kinds of irrigation systems all the way down.
Already all in place.
And so...
You need to create the irrigation system first.
Yeah. Yeah. So behind that simple claim, there's an awful lot of work that has to have been implemented to enable it to be a truth.
Yeah.
But okay, that's as a metaphor.
It's a metaphor that does make sense to you, though. This field irrigation system, so long as it's all in place, if the system's in place...
Yeah.
And
but it's a bit foreign to me, though, because we don't have irrigated fields here. We get enough rain anyway, so... But then... That's just a detail. Yeah. Thank you. It's an interesting book, then.
It's quite interesting, yeah.
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 What a shame I never read books.
She encourages people not to read books.
Does she?
Yeah, well, she encourages reading deprivation. It is a paradox that by emptying our lives of distractions, we are actually filling the well. So often, like, books can be distractions. Reading deprivation casts us into our inner silence, a space some of us begin to immediately fill with new words. Long, gossipy conversations, television binging, the radio is a constant chatty companion. We often cannot hear our own inner voice, the voice of our artist's inspiration above the static. In practicing reading deprivation, we need to cast a watchful eye on these other pollutants. They poison the well. If we monitor the inflow and keep it to a minimum, we will be rewarded for our reading deprivation with embarrassing speed. Our reward will be a new outflow. So she's assuming that the person is in
avidly reading.
Yeah.
but for me, that the application of that is, do I really need to have the news on while I'm eating?
Yeah.
Right. So it's a way of me choosing to keep up to date with the news at a time when it's available and we're together. Whereas you could say, well, that's a really bad time to bother listening to the news because you could be talking to each other. So,
what seeds are being sowed in the garden of the mind is the question, and which Mum's book, The News, which is the news, relates to.
Yeah.
And she says at least one student always explains to me pointedly in no uncertain terms that he or she is a very important and busy person with duties and obligations that include reading. This information is inevitably relayed in a withering tone that implies I am an idiot child, an artistic flake, unable to grasp the complexities of an adult's life. I just listen. When the rage has been vented, when all the assigned reading for college courses and jobs has been mentioned, I point out that I have had jobs and I have gone to college, and that in my experience, I have many times wriggled out of reading for a week due to procrastination. So she's saying, as part of this recovering a sense of integrity week, have a week where you don't have, where you really limit what's coming in.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that you have more outflow.
That might mean turning off your phone as well.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up reading at the end, because that was, I tried to not really bring up everything. But that was going to be a treat for you, that she encourages not reading.
Yeah. But actually she means turn off the noise.
Yeah, she's...
Whatever source.
Or just removing the habit. Like the thing that you go to, whatever the go-to is. And then she lists these different things you could do when you're not reading. listen to music, make curtains, knit, cook, fix a bike. Sooner or later, if you are not reading, assuming that otherwise you are reading, you will run out of work and be forced to play. You'll light some incense. Isn't that what you're always doing when you're not reading? Lighting incense, putting on an old jazz record, or painting a shelf turquoise. And then you will feel not just better, but actually a little excited. Don't read. If you can't think of anything else to do, cha-cha. Yes, you can read and do this week's task.
I think the thing I'm in sync with her on this is that if you're reading, then you're submitting to someone else's diet. They're feeding you whatever it is you've chosen to pick up to read.
Yeah.
And that could be quite conscious, fine. But if you're listening to the news, then you're going to get whatever the news is, and in the form that you don't really want it, because I find it annoying most of the ways the news is being reported. So yeah, I think she's got a very good point, but in my case, it has relevance in other media than reading.
She says, if you break your reading deprivation, write about how you did it. In a tantrum, a slip-up, a binge. How did you feel about it? Why? So these are examples of different ways in which you might recognize the thing that you're unwilling to give up. And then use the morning pages or whatever to, she'd recommend the morning pages, not the whatever, to catch yourself in the act of reacting to the idea that thing needs to go, or that thing, because then that's a sign of addiction, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you can't cope without the thing.
Yeah. Well, I'm definitely addicted to my inbox. Yeah,
and she says figure out what your poison is, name your poison.
Yeah.
And then that's where the block is. Figure out what the block is, and then have the field irrigation system do its thing.
Good.
Cool. Well, yeah, that was really good. I'm glad there was a little bonus reading back.